We gather to worship, our hearts alive with hope, that here we will be truly seen, that here we will be welcomed into the garden of this community, where the simple and the elegant, the fluted and frilled, the shy and the dramatic complement one another and are treasured. May we know that here each contributes in their own way to the beauty of the whole. Come, let us worship together. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Open your ears. Open your ears to the song. Open your ears to the song. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Open your hearts, everyone. Open your hearts, everyone. Open your hearts, everyone. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Don't be afraid of some change. Don't be afraid of some change. Don't be afraid of some change. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Yes. Enter, rejoice, and come in.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Really good to be with you here today. And what hopefully is the tail end of a streak of very warm summer weather. I don't see people fanning themselves yet, but give it time. I think a lot about the weather these days. I think a lot about the relationship between our short-term weather patterns and our changing climate. As a scholar and teacher of anthropology, the topic of human-caused climate change is something I think about and talk about in my teaching and research a great deal. I really like Laura's story because it's a beautiful illustration of how we are all truly in the same boat. My discipline is dedicated to understanding just one species, Homo sapiens, our evolution, the ways in which we adapt to our surroundings, the story of our rise and spread as a planetary species. We try to understand the human species in its entirety, our biology, our evolution, our language, and our behavior, shaped as it is by this thing we call culture. In my teaching, I talk to my students about the implications of climate change for their own lives and communities, and try to help them put it into the larger context of human history to grasp what it may mean for the future of our species as a whole. The science behind the causes of anthropogenic or human-caused climate change is quite well understood at this stage. It's a fairly straightforward scientific detective story told by climate scientists, physicists, geologists, geographers, and others, documenting the changes in Earth systems over a period of time which coincides with the rise of industrialization, our increased reliance on fossil fuels, and the global acceleration of resource exploitation in the second half of the 20th century. If we can accept the science of climate change in the same way we can accept the science behind engineering or modern medicine, then the only real question that remains is, what can we do about it? The scientific answer to that question is, we humans need to rapidly decarbonize our societies on a global scale to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius in order to avoid what scientists, who are not generally given to hyperbole or dramatic language, refer to as catastrophic climate change. And by catastrophic, they mean conditions that our ancestors have not seen in over 4 million years, and which will stretch the limits of our global civilization to provide for even the basic human needs of an ever larger segment of the world's population. And it's right about this point that my students start to wonder if it's too late to drop my class. Because this is alarming stuff, it's depressing, and we generally don't want to think about things like this because Yeah, it's just hard. And coming to grips with something that's so complex, slow-moving, and all-encompassing feels daunting, if not hopeless. As I tell my students, the balance that we continually need to seek is between justifiable concern and hope. The science tells us what we need to do. The rapid decarbonization of our globalized economy. Sounds easy, right? The head knows what to do, but the question is, can the heart follow? So, at this point, you're probably wondering what climate change has to do with the talk about community and tribes. Hang in there. When my students ask me what we can do about climate change, I tell them that we already know how to fix it. It's not that we need more science or new technology. It's just that our culture may need some tweaks to its programming. By which I mean, our sense of community somehow has to be tweaked so that we see this not as someone else's problem or responsibility, but as a species-level problem that involves all of us. In other words, the solutions to climate change are not scientific, but primarily political, economic, cultural, and moral ones. How do we collectively negotiate solutions that involve changes in behavior, values, beliefs and attitudes across countries, communities, identities, cultures, and nations? How do we learn to think beyond the boundaries and short-term needs of our own family, our community, our tribe, or nation? How do we imagine a world in which collective, species-level responses to the challenges of climate change are even possible? Most importantly, how can we rise to the challenges of climate change while also addressing existing forms of inequality, injustice, and domination, which are both part of the problem and obstacles to just solutions? These questions beg solutions which require that we expand our notion of community, that we make our tribes more broadly inclusive in making common cause against an external threat. It's what humans do. It's what we've always done. There is a common ground here in our common need for all that we derive from the natural world, materially and spiritually. Unfortunately, forging a consensus on these issues at the national, much less the global level, has been made all the more difficult by the historical moment in which we now find ourselves. Social and political movements around the world have led to an embrace of populism, ethno-nationalism, and the rejection of pluralistic democratic norms and institutions by significant numbers of people in many countries. A loss of faith in the promises of the modern world order has helped generate our reactionary political moment, fueled by social anxieties about cultural change, backlash against the forces of globalization, and fear of the other, whether they come in the guise of internal minority groups, immigrants, refugees, or different political tribes. In other words, precisely at the moment when we need to get our act together and transcend our parochial, provincial boundaries and embrace collective action on a global scale, there are powerful counter-forces which would have us run headlong in the opposite direction. These forces would have us pursue short-term self-interest, build greater barriers, and dismantle the very collaborative frameworks that will be crucial in overcoming the challenges of climate change. In our own country, the tribalization of our politics, coupled with a systematic corporate campaign of disinformation comparable to that of the tobacco industry in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, has both polarized and paralyzed the possibility for meaningful action on climate change at the national level. The days when a bipartisan consensus on common sense environmental measures was possible seem to be irretrievably lost at first glance. While there are no easy answers to these challenges, and I don't pretend to offer any today, I would like to simply offer up a few concepts which my discipline has developed to help us think about the habits of the human heart in terms of how we define ourselves and our communities. The source of all knowledge and hope is understanding. Only then can we begin to forge a common purpose out of the complex tapestry of cultural difference. So, the first concept we refer to as cultural relativism. This is Anthropology 101. Sorry, I am a teacher. I usually have my students at the start of an introductory course write about and interpret an experience which they've had in which they've experienced cultural difference or culture shock. Anthropologists believe that in order to understand another culture, they must observe human behavior and try to understand and interpret it in terms of the native point of view, to put oneself imaginatively in the shoes of the other. Through the method of participant observation, the anthropologist attempts to understand how another way of life makes sense as a coherent design for living, in its own terms, while temporarily suspending the cultural frameworks and judgments which we all carry with us like a pair of well-worn shoes. It requires an act of empathetic imagination, but it also requires face-to-face contact in a set of shared experiences. I tell my students that what cultural relativism emphatically does not mean is that they have to abandon their own moral code or values, nor does it mean that anything goes, that they must accept all cultural practices as equally valid or acceptable. Rather, each cultural community is one moment in the long story of human adaptation to a changing world. Most are successful, at least in the short run, but in the long run, the only cultural constants are continuous change, reinvention, or loss. The cross-cultural comparative data set of anthropology includes every culture, every band of humans across time and space in the history of our species, who collectively found their own unique path to survival, flourishing in almost every conceivable ecological niche on the planet. Each is worthy of our effort to understand, if only for the cautionary tales they provide. Another anthropological concept, one perhaps more important in giving us insight into the human heart, is the idea of ethnocentrism. Broadly, it describes the tendency of every human alive to view their own culturally prescribed way of life as the only normal and natural way for human beings to live. And as for other people's way of life, not so much. Ethnocentrism, as they say, gets a very bad rap, as it can potentially lead to all manner of unpleasant behavior towards members of out-groups by the members of in-groups. Inequality, prejudice, persecution, outright genocide. At best, it entails sheer indifference toward the conditions of other humans not of our own tribe. Well, what do we mean by tribes? In the era of modern nation-states, the term has a derogatory connotation, suggesting irrational loyalties to one's own community, right or wrong. As author Leila Lalami noted in The Atlantic recently, the impulse to belong to a clan is deeply human, and new tribes continue to form, organized not around ancestry, but along fuzzier lines of ideology or demography. Modern tribes, like ancient ones, have idiosyncratic languages. One faction might speak of illegal aliens, traditional families, and the life of the unborn, while the other talks of undocumented workers, marriage equality, and my body, my choice. They rule over separate territories, listen to different oracles, uphold distinct values, and dismiss contradictory information as unreliable propaganda or fake news. And yet, ethnocentrism is also an essential element of the human experience. It is what binds us together as families, as communities, as otherwise disconnected individuals. The warm, fuzzy feeling of belonging is indeed one of the central pleasures of being human. In his studies of Austrian national identity, anthropologist Robert Rotenberg refers to the German concept of Heimat, or homeland, to refer to this down-home feeling of being among one's own in a community of shared values, assumptions and understandings, a place where unwanted encounters with difference never force us to explain ourselves, or watch what we say, or feel the shock of the unfamiliar. As much as we may complain about the parochialism of other people's value communities, we acknowledge the powerful hold which belonging to a group has over our own hearts and minds. As the words of covenanting and community in the UU hymnal refrain, after all, it is good to be together. What anthropologists will tell you is that how we define our kind and our cultural identity is a moving target. Human identities are mutable and changing, constantly renegotiated to match new circumstances and new encounters, providing meaning and purpose beyond the necessities of mere survival. The question is, how do we scale up this longing for a common purpose, from our different value communities to the species level. The abstract threat of climate change has become increasingly visible in people's lives around the world, and not just in faraway tropical locales or coastal regions. The Northern Hemisphere is currently in the grip of an unprecedented heat wave that matches or exceeds the predictions of climate models over the past 14 years. And even in a red state like Utah, poll data shows that over 70% of Utahns say that climate change is real. Another cornerstone of my discipline is the principle of holism, the idea that everything in the human and natural world is interconnected. The story of the past 250 years is one of fossil fuel revolution, industrial revolution, global integration through colonialism and global capitalism, and now the inexorable rise of atmospheric carbon and other ways in which we are exceeding our planetary boundaries. In other words, for the civilization my students have inherited, the ultimate adaptive challenge we face is one of our own making. The one constant of biological and cultural evolution is change. Adaptation is a moving target, and in the 300,000 plus or minus history, 300,000 year history of Homo sapiens, human societies have coped with the moving goalposts set by our planet with a range of adaptive responses analogous to those of biological evolution. We adopt new technologies, new shared ways of life. We exploit new resources, including each other. We abandon our home ranges, or we go extinct. The human story I try to tell my students involves putting these processes in the context of what our species has been up to in the last 11,000 years or so since we began farming. This involves the inexorable spread of social complexity, or that thing we call civilization. Human societies that have grown more complex, interdependent, specialized, unequal, globalized, and frequently more fragile. And yet, that interdependence is also our strength. Economic globalization has been condemned by those both on the political left and the political right for the inequalities and ecological destruction that it has wrought. But the globalization of knowledge, of communications, and of moral frameworks such as human rights are also the great emerging strength of our species. Globalization is both a cause of and the solution to our current predicament. From the spread of clean energy technology to templates for environmental legislation or new sustainable ways of farming or organizing economic activity. Moral globalization can be seen in the abstract principles such as democracy and human rights, which tend to be broad and universalizing forces for unity across narrow sectarian boundaries. Such principles as equality, justice, and other fundamental human rights define the minimum common denominators of human freedom and dignity, and are enshrined in documents such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, set out in 2015, which link human rights to the environmental conditions necessary for their fulfillment. Such frameworks are powerful adaptive tools that are taken up and fleshed out in countless ways by individuals, nations, national governments, transnational groups around the globe in order to address the challenges of climate change. 197 countries have signed on or acceded to the Paris Agreement within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, with currently only one signatory country intent on leaving, by the way. Guess which one? This heralds an unprecedented degree of international cooperation in addressing the existential threat. Is it enough? No. But it is beginning. And it shows the emergence of the kind of species-level planetary thinking that we are in desperate need of. Even in Utah, the legislature, in March of this year, passed a non-binding resolution, House Concurrent Resolution 7, which commits the legislature to the use of science to address the causes of climate change and encourages the responsible use of natural resources and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The resolution was crafted by climate activists working with a group of high school students from Logan, who managed to get bipartisan sponsorship and were incredibly eloquent in explaining its importance to our state legislators. Small steps, and yet hopeful ones, in an atmosphere where tribal loyalties and the taking of sides have often become more important than the common sense of shared human dignity and stewardship over our future. The paradox of our era in human history is that tribal values and universal principles can and must coexist. So, what adaptive mechanisms are available to us? Do we rely on new tools, new technologies, new ways of life, find new home ranges? If we think the current refugee crisis, unquote, is bad now, give it another 50 years, the movement of people will dwarf anything that's happening now. Do we now possess the adaptive capacity to reconfigure our cultural inheritance, to redirect ourselves on our cultural path? To put it in contemporary terms, are we capable of rewriting the cultural software of our civilization to allow future generations to adapt and flourish? As an anthropologist, I've always been fascinated by the stories we humans tell about ourselves, about who we are and where we've come from. As cultural critic Frederick Davison put it, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of global capitalism as we know it. It's also easier to imagine apocalyptic climate change than it is to imagine the individual and collective work of enacting serious measures to mitigate and adapt to it. I would rather that my students' narrative of the future not center around dystopian narratives about the end of the world. As an educator, my goal is to help my students imagine and write their own stories about our collective future as a species, and then to make it so. Blessed be.